All right, everybody, and we are live on the YouTubes. Welcome to another episode of The Unapologetic Apologist. I'm your host, Stallman Smith Jr., and today we're doing a debate review of a debate that happened a couple of nights ago between Matt Dillahunty and my guest. Joining me, he's been on the show before, my friend Ben Fischer. Ben, how you doing, sir?
I'm doing well. Very happy, pleased to be with you tonight, Stellman. I'm really looking forward to a thrilling time.
Yeah. No, we were just talking before the program about how COVID has really been an unprecedented time. How have you been since we last spoke on the program?
Well, it's been a learning curve. We've certainly turned our attention to developing benfisherministries.com and our overall web presence in some new ways. We've seen about a 370 some odd percent increase in visitorship to our websites, and more people are requesting to become site members. We've also seen with our online school, Apologetics University, some significant growth, about 82 persons that are now subscribed to products on that website, training programs and
Wow.
tools that help Christians and unbelievers to understand the argument that we're delivering in defense of the Christian faith. So it's been awesome to see, but it has been a tremendous learning curve, I have to say.
Very cool. And the program and everything, can people find that through benfisherministries.com?
Yes, there's some links that are right there on the homepage for the website that people can get access to some of our free products. One of them in particular uh, overviews an argument that I was able to present to Matt Dillahunty on Modern Day Debate last Friday. And so um, I certainly encourage listeners and viewers to go ahead over to check that out or just simply visit the domain howtodefeatskepticism.com.
Very good. And so, yeah, people, if you can see it, the link is also in the description for benfisherministries.com and also the YouTube channel, Ben Fisher Ministries. So I recommend you guys go there and subscribe. And just real quick, if you want to support this ministry and what I'm trying to do here, interview different apologists and just bring the truth of the gospel, make it an intellectually viable option for thinking people in today's culture, you can head on over to subscribestart.com/TUA. You get bonus content, web extended interviews, stuff like that. So I really do appreciate it. So yeah, just jump right in. So you brought a two-pronged approach to the debate. Is there evidence for God? And in the opening, you talked a lot about religious skepticism. And was your idea there, because obviously you had the axiomatic argument that we'll discuss in a little bit, was your kind of anticipation that, well, here's the skepticism Matt is likely to bring, maybe I should deal with that first and kind of just get ahead of it? Was that kind of your approach there?
Well, yes, I think that essentially the argument that I'm delivering is based off of an argument that was first innovated by philosopher Peter David Klein, as a former professor of philosophy at Rutgers University, and remained there from 1981 until sometime after the turn of the millennium. He really published a very impressive book at the start of his tenure, which was called Certainty, a Refutation of Skepticism. And it lays out an argument against traditional canonical arguments from skepticism, which hold that it is impossible for human beings to have knowledge about true propositions. And so, suspecting that there was some sort of a possible connecting point between philosophical skepticism and religious skepticism, I undertook to do everything I could to review the argument and attempt to lay it against traditional or what are more common now, atheist arguments against the Christian faith. And I found there to be a tremendous applicability. So I took the argument and adapted it and found that it shared precisely the same classical form, and was able to discover that upon the application of the traditional atheist argument these days, what winds up happening is the forfeiture of something called the closure principle. So essentially, that was what I presented to Matt as one of the chief problems with much of the argumentation that we traditionally see from people who call themselves atheists. And so it was wonderful to see his interaction to all of that, although I don't know that he fully appreciated the power of the argument, but I suppose that's what we're here to talk about.
Yeah, he seemed to just kind of brushed away as, well, that's not my version of skepticism, so I don't know why you took the time to go after it. Um,
Right.
But I
That's
think it
right.
was important because, as far as if someone's going to be more sophisticated and want to look into the literature, it is going to matter more than just what one person kind of defines as their own personal skepticism, and more what the literature defines as religious skepticism. So,
Yes, and it's very interesting to see. I think that essentially he held there to be some sort of chasm of separation between what he called scientific skepticism and philosophical skepticism. And I don't really think that there are a lot of people that would affirm that the core primitive basis of the argument is really very different. And so I don't think that that approach succeeds for a variety of reasons. And I'm sure that we can get into that. So,
mhm. Yeah, so I
yeah.
guess maybe the first question would be kind of laid out in the inverse. What would be, how would you present, say, skepticism or religious skepticism, perhaps in its strongest form? How, say, a proponent of it might want to present it?
Well,
Oh, I apologize. I don't know if you can hear me. Your video just
from
froze.
philosophical skepticism.
Oh, there we go.
Pardon?
Oh, I'm sorry. Your video froze there, but we got you back now.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Hoping that my sound didn't go out. So essentially, the two arguments share precisely the same classical form. And that classical form is laid out in three premises, like so. If I know that P is true, I also know that Q is false. I cannot know that Q is false. Therefore, I cannot know that P is true.
Mhm.
Now, this argument really does seem enormously similar to what we often hear from skeptical people. If I know that Christianity is true, I know that Hinduism is false. I can't know that Hinduism is false. Therefore, I cannot know that Christianity is true. I think it's just obvious to most of us, or any person that's been in ministry for any length of time, and I certainly have been in ministry full time now for roughly 20 years. And I cannot count the number of times that I have heard a story of a Christian young person who has deconverted on the basis of what seems to them to be the strength of that argument. The
Oh,
only
Ben,
problem
I'm
is,
sorry to interrupt you.
sure,
People are commenting and saying that they have a hard time hearing you. I don't know if you have a volume dial on your microphone that you
sure,
can turn up.
sure. Does that seem better?
So I can hear you fine. People in the comment section, let me know. Let me know if you
Yes,
can
please
hear
do.
Ben, because some people are
Mhm.
saying they couldn't hear, but then someone was saying they could. It was just very low.
It was very low. Okay. Well,
Okay,
hoping
so
that this makes
someone just commented and said they can hear you.
okay, good. So I guess I'll just go ahead and explain what I just
Yeah,
explained, which
yeah.
is that the argument of religious skepticism carries precisely the same classical form as does philosophical skepticism, and this would certainly include a variety of family of arguments that issue from skepticism. Essentially, that classic form proceeds as follows. If I know that P is true, I know that Q is false. I can't know Q is false, therefore I cannot know that P is true. Now, this really does seem to be precisely the same classical form as we often hear from religious skepticism, because the religious skepticism often will say to us, if I know that Christianity is true, I know, say, Hinduism is false, but I can't know that Hinduism is false, therefore I cannot know that Christianity is true. And so we can see, therefore, that religious skepticism and philosophical skepticism, and this would certainly extend to other forms as well, it carries precisely the very same classical form. And if it turns out, as it in fact does, that that classical form has been sufficiently questioned and soundly defeated within secular academia, then we have a good grounds for collapsing religious skepticism, and this argument needn't detain anyone any longer. Now, what the interesting thing is that happened during the debate is that Matt attempted to show that this was somehow not relevant to atheists or to persons who have deconverted from the Christian faith. And I don't really think that that's true. I've been in ministry for roughly 20 years, and I've lost count of the number of Christian young people that have deconverted due to the perceived strength of that argument. If P, not Q, I cannot know not Q, therefore I cannot know that P. So I think that that's essentially the germ of it. And from there, the argument really rolls out in a very compelling way.
Yeah, so I guess before we get into a refutation of it, I did just have one question as you were going through it. If someone, say, presented the argument in that very syllogistic form, if I know Christianity is true, I would know that Hinduism is false. I can't know Hinduism is false, therefore I can't know Christianity is true. What would be, say, a justification for asserting the second premise that one can't know Hinduism is false?
This is very interesting. Essentially, here, what most skeptics tend to do without realizing it is that they apply and employ uh, one of the key principles of a defeated theory of knowledge, which is called the tracking theory. The old tracking theorists were Fred Dretske, I think, who first introduced the concept in 1973, and then Robert Nozick really turned it into something that was a larger, fuller, more robust system in 1981. The tracking theorists essentially held that knowledge could be acquired through the use of certain counterfactual conditionals. And so one of those counterfactual conditionals was called the sensitivity requirement. That is, that our beliefs need to be sensitive to the possibility that our beliefs are false. So if a given proposition is proposed to us, if there is some reason that we would be prevented from knowing whether or not the original contingent proposition is false, then therefore the knowledge proposition fails to meet the sensitivity requirement. Therefore, even if it is true that it adheres to reality in some sense, that it adheres to the fact that this proposition is true, nevertheless, because we wouldn't know it if, or wouldn't realize it, wouldn't be able to realize it if it was false, then therefore it doesn't count as knowledge. So essentially, what the skeptic is typically doing without realizing it is that he's applying the sensitivity requirement to religious knowledge. And by doing so, the effect that this has is that it collapses the closure principle if P, then Q, or if P, not Q. Or if P is likely, then and P implies Q, then Q is likely. The problem with that is that that very result winds up imploding the basis for legal knowledge, the basis for legal evidence, the basis for philosophical evidence, the basis for scientific evidence. In fact, there are very, very few arguments that we can think of which would still be able to stand up as strong evidence for anything. And so, for this reason, most contemporary epistemologists have concluded that Robert Nozick was in fact mistaken. The sensitivity requirement is too strong a condition for knowledge of almost any kind because of the way that it affects the closure principle. But that requires some additional explanation.
Yeah, well, it just me not being an expert in this stuff, it just strikes me as odd at first glance to think that the evidence, say, for the proposition, say, the truth of Christianity, would be affected by say, the lack of evidence to disprove another religion, Hinduism. I guess I just don't see the connection there.
Well, I think that essentially because the reason why the argument sounds so appealing is because of its usance of the closure principle. And this is a
Right.
principle which virtually all philosophers agree is true. We could say it like this: if a given novel prediction that I issue winds up being verified, then my hypothesis is more likely to be true. This is an
Yeah.
instantiation of the closure principle within the context of the scientific method. Now, if it is the case that the closure principle is invalid, then it just becomes the case that novel predictions don't lead you to the conclusion that a hypothesis is more likely, because the closure principle cannot be issued or cannot be utilized as a sound way to be able to show that a given proposition it becomes closed to further questioning. And this really presents some enormous problems at the very heart of our philosophy of knowing, our epistemologies. So for the skeptic to say that this is somehow irrelevant, to me is just that kind of response seems to me to be just woefully inept to be able to understand the significance of the problem that we've just uncovered. It seems to me that imploding the closure principle is a very, very dangerous place to go. So, whatever theory of knowledge we go about employing, if this is the effect, it has to be wrong. And most contemporary epistemologists have concluded that that is true, even atheist epistemologists, such that no practically no epistemologist would be willing to suffer the implosion of the closure principle only to prove atheism. And since that's the case, well, I'm a Christian. I, of course, would be find myself very sympathetic in this case to the atheist philosopher and say, I think that that's true. I think that whatever we say knowledge is, if our definition of knowledge implodes closure, then that definition has to be wrong. And that's precisely what the religious skeptic has done. He's essentially said that the sensitivity requirement must be met in order for religious knowledge to be verified. And by doing that, the effect becomes the implosion of the closure principle. But I think that before we go any further, it might be wise for us to just simply explain why it is that closure implodes when you apply this sensitivity requirement.
No, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And please do that. I just might ask real quick. I did get one more comment from somebody asking if you could turn your mic up. They said they can hear you. It's just they said I'm twice as loud, but I did try turning my mic down a bit.
Okay.
And then so I just didn't know if yours could go up anymore. I guess I will.
All right. Hopefully that's right. Can they hear it better now?
It will take a second for me to get comments, but I think so. I did start getting a few comments. So yeah, I'll ask my friend to text me and just make sure everything's working out. But yes, I guess proceed with the thought you were just mentioning.
Sure. So at this point, many people will want to be explained how they want an explanation how it is that the application of the sensitivity requirement implodes the closure principle. Why does that follow as a result of applying the sensitivity requirement? And so the explanation here would be to go to the very one that Nozick himself cited. Nozick essentially cited a very classical argument from skepticism. It's taken on various forms throughout the centuries. It first appeared, I think, and most philosophers would admit that this is true. It first appeared under the pen of René Descartes, who presented it as the evil demon argument, Descartes' evil demon, who has essentially laid traps for my credulity and has tricked me into believing that when I am asleep, I'm really awake and that I'm walking about in the world as it is. So that was essentially René Descartes' presentation of it. Now, René Descartes' classical argument has changed over the centuries, and it has morphed into the evil genius or the evil mad scientist who has taken a person's brain, removed it from his body, dispensed of all of the post-cranial content of the remains, and then invatted that brain into a case of liquid and is stimulating it with electricity in order to persuade the subject that the person is actually walking around the real world when in actuality, they're just simply living inside of a simulation. Now, most of us remember probably the best picture of this, which would have been The Matrix, the film The Matrix, was put out in the year 1999 by the famous film director duo, the Wachowski brothers. And I think most people would say that it was their biggest smash hit. And essentially, The Matrix told the story of a man named Neo who was suddenly unplugged from a computer, only to discover that up until the present time, his entire life has been nothing but a dream. Well, Nozick essentially invites us to ask the question, what would have happened if the subject had been told by the computer that his body lay invatted in a tube of biodegradable goop? What would have happened in that case? If that had been the case, then the test subject would now know that his senses were deceiving him and that the real world lay somewhere beyond his present empirical borders. But the problem which naturally follows is, does that really count as knowledge? And the problem was that according to conventional classical definitions of knowledge, it did. Going back as far as Plato, one of the earliest of the Greek philosophers and the founder of the Academy, Plato held that there were three essential ingredients that we needed in order for us to say that a given S or a subject has knowledge. And those three ingredients were truth, proof, and belief. Truth, proof, and belief. And so we simply return to the example of the matrix. Does Neo now have truth, proof, and belief concerning the real reality of his existence? Well, it seems that if we look at that list and consider number one, truth, does Neo have truth? Well, it seems that the machine story was true. Neo was inverted in a tube of chemicals. Number two, does Neo believe the machine story? Well, by supposition, we're saying that he does. Number three, justification. Is there some sort of a proof or a justification for Neo believing that he's lying in the matrix? Well, the machine, the very one that had perpetrated the crime of inserting him into the matrix, is the one that is now admitting to his crime. So therefore, Neo has truth, proof, and belief. The question is, does that count as knowledge? It seemed to Nozick that it didn't count as knowledge because Neo had not been personally responsible for sensing the truth of his condition. Therefore, even if it is the case that he knows that he's in the matrix P and deduces from that that his senses are now deceiving him, that's Q, he has the closure principle right there in front of him, yet because he has not been told, or he has not deduced the truth of his own condition, therefore he doesn't really know he's in the matrix. It doesn't count as knowledge. Now, the problem with that, of course, is that would mean that we now have a novel exception to what would have otherwise been a generalized principle of philosophy, of contemporary epistemology, and that's the closure principle. If P, then Q. The fact that we know Q closes P to further questioning. And so that effect is what most modern critics of Robert Nozick find so abhorrent. Because now, since the closure principle fails to be generalized, therefore we can't imply things from other things. Now just stop and think about it for a moment. What could be known on the basis of any body of evidence if one proposition does not imply another thing, and we can't put together chains of evidence that lead to conclusions? Well, if that were the case, then we'd have to say that we really don't know how to go about constructing arguments for legal evidence, arguments for scientific evidence, arguments for philosophical evidence, and this requires a massive revision of what we normally understand knowledge to be and what we normally understand evidence to be. That has led most philosophers to conclude that there's something wrong with Nozick's sensitivity requirement. This requirement is too strong a requirement for knowledge of almost any kind. And what's good for the goose in this case is good for the gander. If that works for philosophical skepticism, it really does work for religious skepticism as well, because in both cases, we're dealing with things that we can't see. So I think that this is the main problem that causes essentially the implosion of the skeptic's argument, because going back to the skeptic's argument, he typically argues, if P, not Q, I don't know not Q, therefore I don't know P. That's essentially what he's arguing. But of course, the closure principle shows up in the first premise of the argument. But if in the second premise, the skeptic claims that we can't know Q because Q is unknowable, it's not beholden to our senses, the result of that is that the first premise becomes imploded and therefore the conclusion is invalid.
Mm-hmm.
And therefore, essentially, the atheist, the typical atheist who refuses to issue propositional arguments, has lost one of the chief arguments in defense of his worldview. And I think this is absolutely devastating to many of the types of arguments that we hear from skepticism. Now, interestingly, I have a lot of atheist friends, and one of them once asked me, what about the problem of underdetermination? That is, let's say that we simply just argue in defense of skepticism on some other basis than the closure principle. What if we don't employ the closure principle and therefore we don't surrender it by a poor argument like the one I just described? What if it's the case that just simply the evidence we have fails to point in one direction or another, kind of like a broken compass? a compass that doesn't point true north. Therefore, you can't be sure of where it's pointing in any given direction, whether it's north, south, east, or west, because the compass is broken. The compass cannot be relied upon. Our senses cannot be relied upon to show us whether or not it's any one of a number of different live options or possibilities to choose from, whether it be the wild-eyed spaghetti monster, God, or one of 100 other different explanations for this unseen entity that we're describing. Well, in that case, once again, it is true that the skeptic who's issuing the argument from the problem of underdeterminism is not appealing to the closure principle, but nevertheless, he's still appealing to the sensitivity requirement. And in so doing, he's already forfeited the closure principle before he issues the argument. Therefore, even the argument from the problem of underdeterminism also falls to pieces, and the skeptic loses the argument. So I don't think there's really any comeback from this. Either atheism has got to completely switch from religious skepticism to only arguing for propositional atheism, or simply admit to the Christian that he has lost the argument. This is a tremendous quandary. It represents a dramatic shift in the landscape of the broader conversation that we're having right now between atheists, agnostics, and Christians. It really is a totalizing argument, and I can't think of any other argument that has this broad of an impact upon the appeal for atheism.
Yeah, that's all really fascinating. And do you think perhaps the chief reason for it is something you mentioned to me earlier, which was that the atheists are basing their argument not off a proposition of atheism, not of a worldview, say a worldview that they can argue for, like naturalism.
Right.
Rather, they've just kind of gone after the lack theism thing to say, well, it's just a lack of belief.
Right. Essentially, that's the problem, is that because they're appealing to skepticism as a justifiable reason for why they are justified in essentially being atheists, therefore, they just simply say, well, then I've got a good reason to continue and to proceed in life in my atheism. It's really unfortunate that they continue to do that, but essentially, I think that we can show that they're doing it for no good reason, because we now know that the argument of skepticism has been officially collapsed. And if that's true within secular academia, why on earth wouldn't it be true in the context of religious discussion, since the two arguments carry one and the same classical form? So essentially, that's the appeal.
Yeah, and we're gonna move on to kind of a question I have: what counts as evidence, and a clip from the debate. But real quick, I did have a thought as you were going through that, and I don't know if this will be super relevant or not, but I am curious as to your thoughts on it. When we talked about justified true belief, being what constitute knowledge, then the example of Neo in the Matrix, it seemed that we said it was he had a true belief. It was a belief. But then it seemed the point when we say it was justified maybe could be tweaked a little bit, in the sense that we're calling it justified because we're saying, well, the machine is telling him, and that's what's justifying it. But we might say from an individualistic perspective, of Neo's perspective, that he's not justified in holding the belief because he didn't rationally come to the conclusion. So I don't know if that's relevant or not, but it does seem to me, at least if we're speaking from Neo's perspective, we could say it's not justified. It's just a true belief.
Right. Essentially, that's the substance of the appeal, is that Neo has a belief, and he has essentially it is a true belief. It's not a false belief, and the gripe is with the justification component. And it's interesting that Nozick does not take exception to the point that Neo, in this case. Obviously, the Matrix film didn't come out in 1981 when Robert Nozick published Philosophical Explanations, but nevertheless, that's the one that we're all culturally familiar with. So let's just go ahead with that. So Nozick doesn't actually take exception to whether or not Neo has a reasonable justification for a belief that he has, which turns out to be true. Instead, he simply says that the problem is that we need to add to Plato's original classical definition of knowledge a twofold test, namely the sensitivity requirement and the adherence requirement. Now, obviously, we can see that Neo's condition it is fully congruent with the adherence requirement, because the adherence requirement simply demands that Neo's belief must adhere to the reality of what's happening to him. That's fine. That works. But then this other secondary counterfactual requirement, which is essentially that Neo must have the ability to have sensitivity to his belief. It needs to be such that that S, or the subject, or Neo, would believe it if it was true, and he would deny it if it wasn't. And he's not able to deny it if it wasn't, because he's merely been told that it's true by the unseen entity of the machine, unbeholden to him. And so that's essentially the crux of the argument. Essentially, that really does, in many ways, in many respects, that's very, very similar to the Gettier problem, which was a problem that was published in a very short paper known for its brevity in 1963 by Edmund Gettier. And these Gettier problems were essentially cases in which you had truth, justification, and belief, and yet, nevertheless, you didn't have knowledge. Gettier essentially showed something is missing from this description. What is it? I don't know. Let's go ahead and figure it out. So that was the crux of his paper. And then from that, Western academia has had to live with the problem that we don't have a complete description of knowledge. And of course, this is very problematic for a lot of thinkers in the academy. But I think it's important to note that most philosophers nevertheless agree that truth, proof, and belief are still constituent to knowledge. We're just simply adding something to the list, a fourth thing, whatever that thing is. Alvin Plantinga said maybe we should add warrant. Maybe there's some sort of warrant that needs to be added to justification. And then you have truth, belief, justification, and warrant of some kind. A lot of people thought that that was pretty good. Peter David Klein thought that was pretty good from Rutgers University, but it failed to gain a sort of generalized appeal across the broader swath of epistemologists. And many, many people have put out something that we might add to that list to complete our definition of knowledge, but no one's been able to put forth something that's satisfactory and gains a very broad appeal. And so the result of this is that we have an incomplete account of knowledge. Now, I'm not going to try to add to that list in the context of discussion for the existence of God. That is an entirely different issue. How do we give a complete description of what knowledge is? I'm just going to go ahead and leave that issue on the cutting room floor. But I am going to insist with the majority of epistemologists today that whatever we add to Plato's original list, whether it be warrant, vindication, or whatever you add to it, whatever we add cannot implode the closure principle. It has to play nice with closure. If it doesn't do that, it's wrong. So that's where most of epistemologists are today. And so, I probably gets a little bit more into some of the woods, so to speak, than maybe you were asking for. But maybe that's interesting to somebody. It certainly is to someone like me, because this is what I do all day. So,
yeah, I'm very fascinated with just like deep philosophical things. You know, certain math textbooks go right over my head. Certain science things go right over my head. But deep, like philosophical issues, that's what I love to dive into. So before I get into the first clip I want to play, which doesn't deal directly with the axiomatic argument yet, but it does kind of deal with Matt's kind of outlook and how he kind of takes things into consideration. So just, I guess, briefly, what would you define as evidence? Because that did seem to be one of his main gripes, that axioms aren't the same thing as evidence. But just, I guess, before we get to the axiomatic part, what do you define it as evidence?
Sure. Well, I think that evidence can be a variety of things. We can say that if we have P and we know that P implies Q, and we have a reasonable justification for saying Q is true. And on the basis of this, we can put together chains of evidence. And that's a really important thing, things that imply other things. And I think that's truly important. But I think essentially the reason why Matt was unwilling to accept my presentation, my axiomatic argument, as evidence for God's existence is because he disagrees with the criterion of what would show, what would count as viable evidence. I would say that Matt is holding to something that I've sometimes referred to with my students as the rule of independence. And the rule of independence essentially says that you always prove one proposition to be true by something other than the proposition itself. But that's not the only kind of evidence that we have. And what's more is that when you cling to that rule as the only way to show what valid evidence is, then what winds up taking place is that you lose your ability to prove anything. And that seems to be an unfavorable outcome to the argument. So I think that I wouldn't want to radically adjust our understanding of what could count as evidence by simply asserting the rule of independence, leading to the conclusion that no evidence is satisfactory to ever confer evidence upon some contingent proposition. To me, that's too far. It's too radical, especially when there are other alternatives. And essentially, that's what I suppose we'll walk out here in a couple of minutes.
Mhm. Yeah, so this first clip I have, this is from his opening speech, and it's broken into two parts, and I'll kind of cut it off halfway and see if you want to give it a response. And then the second half I just find very interesting as it complements his other point.
First of all, I would argue, and this is a really bad argument, I'm saying it's a bad argument at the outset, if there was good evidence for God, I would know. And I don't say that in any sort of arrogance about who I am or anything else. Yes, I've been doing this for 15 years and I've spent the bulk of my life studying it, and I've done countless debates with people and I've had people present arguments and evidence. What I'm saying is, if in fact there were good evidence for God, we would all know that this would be Nobel Prize worthy. This would be in the news. Hell, the news reports things that they don't even have good evidence for. Certainly, if we had good evidence for something, this would be newsworthy. There would be no more debates.
So yeah, just that's the first half of it. So just, I guess, because this is a line I hear a lot from atheists, like, oh, well, go collect your Nobel Prize if you've proven the existence of God. So I guess what's your initial reaction to that?
Yeah, it's interesting that he says that if there were evidence for God, it would be newsworthy. Well, actually, that's what's happening right now. On Christmas of 2014 or 15, I can't remember which, the Wall Street Journal published an article written by Eric Metaxas that actually became the most downloaded article in the history of the Wall Street Journal's website. And that article was how science is actually proving the existence of God. And it went on to describe a large number of scientists that have actually put forth various evidences, compelling evidence, at least in the eyes of most people, that there does seem to be a case that can be made that science is pointing towards a divine creator of the universe. So it's ironic that he says that. And what it leads me to believe is that he has adopted a pattern of evidence that he insists all patterns of evidence must cohere to this. But of course, that would lead to roughly the amputation of 2/3 of our traditional means for establishing true propositions. And I don't think most of us are willing to do that. I think we want to have lots of different ways that we can go about trying to prove that something is reasonable. And so I would say that the rule of independence is not the only sole rule. So that's what I would say.
Very good. And then I'm just going to play the second half of this here because, in my opinion, he kind of just refutes what he himself just said. But I'll get your take on it.
Sure.
And the truth is, we live in a world where we can't get people to agree on things that are actually factual and determined and demonstrable. I mean, like facts about climate change. Do we know all of it? No. But there are some people who pretend that this isn't even happening. What about evolution? Evolution is an observable, demonstrable fact. The theory by which we would explain evolution is a scientific theory, a model. We can talk about the efficacies of vaccines. how they actually do work and how they don't cause autism. We can't even necessarily convince people that the earth isn't flat and that their experiences that they think are real with regard to ghosts and aliens probably are not, that merely their personal experience or their interpretation of events aren't necessarily justified. There are things that we know, there are things that we believe and have strong evidence for, and then there are other things.
So I just found that curious because on the one hand, what he just said was if there was evidence, not only would I know, but everyone would know. And I see this kind of from some of my atheist friends where it's just like, they just kind of assume that the natural state of humanity is like an unbiased person. And if you just input the right information, they'll come to the right belief. But then he just turned around and admitted, well, here's all these things we do have good evidence for, even what he would call proof. But yet there are people who just don't accept it. And so it seems that that could almost play against him. Whereas how does he know? He's not in an epistemic position where he's closed himself off to the evidence of God.
Yeah, I really believe that if someone decides in a hard and fast way that only the rule of independence can be used as a means for establishing the truth of some proposition, then I think that we are guilty of adopting a certain bias, which is preventing certain kinds of evidence from being able to come through. What about logical demonstration? So I think that the argument doesn't work. It's not persuasive, at least to me. And so I think that there are persons, even within atheist communities, that will admit that there seems to be something wrong with that. At the end of the day, if we can't admit that there are multiple evidence paths, again, Peter David Klein calls them evidence paths, and you can see this in an article that he wrote that wound up on the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy's website, which is a very, very wonderful free resource. If your viewers want to see some very quality scholarship on these issues and others, essentially showing where the consensus of scholarship is right now, this is a wonderful resource. But getting back to the point, Klein's article outlines these different types of evidence routes that we might take. And the rule of independence is not the only one. Rather, there are other ones. Now, do I know beyond the shadow of a doubt he would only accept the rule of independence? He might deny that if he were here. But I think that if we were to go about trying to sort of poke about at the reason for his unacquiescence, his refusal to acquiesce to the evidence's, conclusions, I think that we would probably find that something like this is kind of lurking behind the curtain, so to speak.
Yeah, and I think that's funny. I think that's a great Yeah, I think that's actually a great transition to the next clip I have here from him.
Sure.
Find curious is that anytime I've attempted to do this, it's only things like astrology, psychics, lucky socks, where people are saying, these things are real, despite the fact that we don't have good evidence that they are. And they would look at it and say, I read my horoscope in the newspaper today. Clearly, astrology has something to it because that was really impactful for me. When they don't understand that one of the things that we need to do is get away from your personal interpretation and understanding of what your experiences are. While you are the best one to decide whether or not you're hungry right now, you may not be the best one to decide that the experience that you have is best attributed to the divine or to aliens or whatever the explanation is. That explanation needs more. And so if the evidence for God tends to be anecdotal, unverifiable, in conflict with other beliefs, that's a problem. If it's
Yeah, so I mean, I guess that just strikes me as like, I would just ask him, well, why think that? Why wouldn't I be in one of the best positions to interpret my religious experience properly?
Yes, think about the funny thing about this is think about the religious experience of Christ himself.
Mhm.
So Christ himself comes and begins to perform miracles and says these are evidence that he is the divine Son of God, the only valid avatar of the Father, essentially. Now, what's interesting about this is that I've only ever heard one debate in which Matt Dillahunty appeared on the stage, and that was with Dr. Mike Licona of Baptist University. So he essentially said that even if it was the case that Jesus went about saying, I can heal people. See, I'm doing it right in front of your eyes, and this proves I'm the Son of God. He says, no, we would still have to iterate our skepticism, ask the question again, and say, maybe there's some other reason why it is that you're performing the miracles that you're performing. Maybe it's not that you're the Son of God. I think there might have been some sort of a loose example thrown about of John Travolta's film in which a man acquires a brain tumor that enables him to do amazing things because various parts of his brain are now connected that weren't previously. So he can spin spoons on the table with his mind, etc. And I think that this really is essentially part of the problem. Is if we just say, well, let's go ahead and just ask the question, why again? Well, why do you think that, Jesus? Why do you think that that proves that you're the Son of God? And why do you think that that next proof proves that you're the Son of God? Essentially, if it is the case that all propositions are contingent, meaning they await our conferring evidence upon them to show that they are in fact valid, then it becomes the case that we're iterating our questions further and further back and forcing them into an infinite regress. If the rule of independence is pushed to that point, then nothing can be proven. At which point I just simply respond to the skeptic and say, well, no wonder you doubt the existence of God. Your requirement for what counts as proof is so incredibly high that we can't even know whether or not the moon exists. And so I just think that this really does violence and harm to our ability to show that anything could be true or anything could fall under the classification of a true proposition. And that's essentially why I think that Sextus Empiricus concluded that the argument of infinitism or the proponent of infinitism fails, because it leads to the unfavorable conclusion that we don't really have a grounding for human knowledge. Now, if this were the only essential thought experiment that Sextus Empiricus put forward, that would be a very depressing thing. And we would have to admit, maybe it is the case that we really can't have a grounding for knowledge. But it wasn't. There were two other possibilities, and one of them in particular that seems to stand up fairly well. And so I think that before one concludes that the rule of independence is the only sane way to go about conferring evidence upon any contingent proposition, one should go about asking, what are the options, the other options that are out there? How might we thought experiment towards different methods for getting at what counts as a true proposition? And personally, I'm very, very compelled by that. I've sometimes been accused by atheists, curiously enough, of asking too many questions, which I think is kind of ironic. Why wouldn't we just go about seeking to sort of discover what are the other live options that are out there? Because that certainly seems like something I don't think very few people would be willing to concede. There are admittedly maybe a few philosophers tucked away here and there somewhere across the swath of scholars in the field that believe that on the basis of the rule of independence, we really can't know anything, that knowledge is impossible. But most philosophers don't think that's true. Otherwise, why be a philosopher? That's just,
yeah.
I mean, we're philosophers because we're curious.
Yeah.
And even lay people can't help being philosophers. I read an article, actually. It was a really interesting article. A couple of guys went out to a subway or a train station somewhere in the United Kingdom. And they essentially set up a sign that said, ask a philosopher. And they just sat there at the booth and waited for people to come to them. Very soon, a large line started to develop and people were asking questions like, what job should I take? What job should I get? Or should I marry this person or that person? And of course, these philosophers were doing the best to handle these very mundane questions, which actually turned out to be very consequential for most of us. But then there was a little girl that comes forward in the line that asked one of the philosophers a wild question. She was 6 years old and she asked the question of this philosophy professor, how do I know I exist? 6 years old.
Wow.
So people are going to philosophize. We're going to engage this because it's almost irresistible. We think, we question, we inquire, And that's a good thing. I take that to be a good thing. And so we should go about trying to say, since infinitism leads to the conclusion that knowledge is impossible, well, then why not try to seek if there are other models? Maybe there are other ways to get at knowledge than just the rule of independence. And as it turns out, there are.
Mm. Yeah, and we'll get into that with the axiomatic argument. My only comment would just be to say, like, I can sympathize with Matt a bit because, of course, he leads off with some extreme examples like astrology, or I have a lucky pair of socks, or I was abducted by aliens. And when there's we can all agree on certain examples when they deliberately, like he said, contradict things we know about reality. But of course, you and I would argue that our religious experience does comport with other things we know about reality, like the historical evidence for the resurrection of Jesus,
Right.
and even the arguments like the axiomatic argument. So yeah, I guess just to ask you, maybe lay out the axiomatic argument for us. I think we might have discussed it last time we were here. I can't remember, but there were certainly some new things that I learned about it watching your debate.
Sure. Well, essentially, the axiomatic argument proceeds from the third option, the third thought experiment that Sextus laid out in his trilemma. And the third thought experiment was essentially the experiment of foundationalism. In other words, if we say that X is proven by Y and Y is proven by Z, well, then how is Z proven? We've just reached the end of a set. The infinitists argued, well, you show that Z is probative on the basis of A prime. And you just simply iterate the argument backwards forever. But the foundationalist says, well, maybe we shouldn't have done that. Once we reached proposition Z, maybe the correct answer was just simply to say that proposition Z wasn't contingent upon anything. In other words, something like proposition Z is proven by proposition Z. Now, that's not circular arguing. Circular arguing would be to say that Z is proven by Y. In other words, it's to circle back to some previous member of the set. So if X is proven by Y, Y is proven by Z, essentially circular reasoning would be to say that Z is proven by Y, not Z is proven by Z. That's something else. To say that Z is proven by Z is to essentially hold that there's some in-principle reason as to why Z is exempt from all proofing. Now, in the event that that sort of an answer is unacceptable to us, as in fact it was to Sextus, how should the inquiry conclude? Well, in answer to that question, Sextus surmised that our investigation thus far has left us with no ability to properly ground human knowledge. In other words, it shows us that it's baseless for us to say that we can know something, as well as to say that we can know nothing. But I think that there are several good reasons for thinking that Sextus had actually reached the wrong conclusion in his argument. And so maybe to wrap up the entire thought experiment, just consider the following. Foundationalism has traditionally taken on two characteristically distinct forms in history. Historically, it's either argued that we must presuppose that Z doesn't need to be proven, or we must demonstrate that Z may be axiomatically proven. Now, what's the difference between those two things? Well, the difference between these two options is, of course, that a presupposition is merely blindly assumed, say you don't have any evidence for it, while an axiom is actually self-evidently true. In other words, an axiom proves itself to be true by virtue of being something that we're never justified in questioning. So, what's an example of that? Well, Sextus's argument. Is it not axiomatically certain that there are only three ways to go about attempting to settle the contingent status of proposition Z? That is, that we either argue that Z is proven by A prime, so we iterate it backwards, or we say Y, which is go the other direction, or we say Z itself. So either you go this way, or you stay put. Isn't that axiomatically certain? I mean, notice that there are no other options for us to choose from beyond our pointing out that in the case of the second option, I mean, isn't it just as invalid to say that Z is proven by Y as it is to say that Z is proven by X? Or Z is proven by A? You sort of your initial contingent proposition, whatever that was. And so an axiom is therefore, properly speaking, a self-evident, irreducible prime. In other words, it's something which upon inspection must necessarily be true and cannot be false. I actually showed this to Matt Dillahunty after getting off of the live stream with him. I just drew a picture of a rectangle on a whiteboard behind me. I split it in half and I said, it is axiomatically certain that this half is smaller than this one is of the rectangle. Isn't that true? He said, oh, that's yeah. I said, that's true. And I said, well, that's essentially what we're talking about when we say an axiom. A plus B is equal to B plus A. Interestingly enough, Dillahunty denied that in our debate, which I was rather amused by. He actually attempted to say that A plus B is equal to B plus A would not be an axiom, and that's false. One of the websites, I don't know if it's Oxford or Stanford or something else, talks about, there's somewhere out there, I read an article on axiomatization in my studies into all of this, and it actually cited that as an axiom. And that just seems like that's self-evidently true. Of course, it's the case that A plus B is equal to B plus A because these are the same entities. And so an axiom is something which, upon inspection, must necessarily be true. It cannot be false. And this means that no independent proof can be reasonably demanded of an axiom. Hey, Z, prove yourself by something else other than you. Because to do that is practically to deny. It's denying the status of the thing under question. It is an axiom, right? Most people would say that it is axiomatic, that Sextus Empiricus showed that there were only 3 possible ways to go about conferring evidence upon true propositions, and that was infinitism, coherentism, and foundationalism. Most people agree that that's true for the past 2,000 years, and 4th or 5th options that people have attempted to put forward have wound up upon inspection just sort of collapsing to versions of one of the 3. Mm. So to me, I think it's silly to say that we don't find there to be information which is axiomatically true. That seems to deny that the process of axiomatization does discover self-evidently true propositions. I think we have to conclude that that's the case. And that's where the majority of epistemology is. The majority of scholars doing work in the field admit that that's true. And actually, Sextus Empiricus's trilemma, or sometimes it's called Agrippa's trilemma, most scholars that I read seem to think that this Sextus's conclusion here is almost irresistible. Mm. So if that's true, if axiomatic proofs are constituent to the argument of foundationalism, then we really do we've discovered, contra Sextus, that we really do have a philosophically acceptable basis for grounding religious knowledge. That is, provided that P is established on the basis of some sort of an axiom, whatever logically follows from P becomes equally as certain as P. So if you've got some sort of a proposition, call it Q, that follows P, and P is an axiom, and P is the axiomatic argument for God's existence, and P definitely shows Q, then Q is true even though it's not an axiom, because you're forming evidence chains. The anchoring chain in your chain of evidences is shown to be an axiom, and that's really good. And I like that because it shows that we have foundations for knowledge. It makes scientific inquiry reasonable and meaningful. It makes philosophical inquiry meaningful and reasonable. It makes legal decisions justifiable, so that juries that condemn persons to prison can go home with a clear conscience. I just don't know what we could claim that could work in society or culture if we just had to relinquish all of this.
Yeah.
So rather than going the route of just sort of becoming an epistemic nihilist, I say, no, I think we do have a reasonable grounds for knowledge. And I think axioms are a good ground for knowledge.
Yeah, no, I agree. And so what would be, I guess, the argument that God is a proper, justifiable axiom? And I actually like the way in the debate that you classified it as a subset of a ontological argument. And Matt said, well, no, I think it's just a first cause argument. But I think you missed the point that what you're making is the first cause would have to apply in any given universe or reality we find ourselves in, which is what makes it a branch of the ontological argument. But maybe you could lay that out.
Sure. And I think that's the main reason that I describe the argument as axiomatic, because it's making a point which the ontological argument makes, and that is that a first cause exists in every possible world, right? It doesn't matter it doesn't matter upon inspection whether or not you're living in this world, the world of Curious George or Van Helsing. What winds up being the case is that a first cause exists, and this cannot be reasonably obviated. Now, I guess it's true that someone could come along and say, well, I'm just going to go ahead and think of it. See, I'm thinking of a world with no first cause. Well, yeah, you're doing that, but it isn't logical. The boundaries of the discussion are whether or not it's logical to do that.
Right.
If it's not metaphysically possible to construct a world that has no beginning, then I would say that shows that we're not justified in concluding such worlds are possible. So we have to limit philosophical inquiry to possible worlds. Possible world scenarios are like case studies that philosophers use to test their intuitions. And so it has to fall into that. It has to be a possible world. So we have to be a stickler about our words here. So sorry to be that way. I know that anyone that does this work is that way, and I take it that your audience is accepting at that point.
Yeah.
But let's just, to get back at the argument, let's just start by imagining, for the sake of argument, that you really are just a brain in a vat. So this is a classical skeptical argument. Let's go ahead and start there. Let's allow the skeptic to choose the weapons in the discussion. Let him set the ground rules. So go ahead. Let's just say it is the worst case scenario. An evil mad scientist has cleverly wired your cerebrum and is now controlling your every sensory experience. Now, would it perhaps surprise you that you could still deduce, even in such dire straits, that God exists? See, the argument turns out to be virtually irrefutable. Come what may, the divine conclusion persists. The case, however, ultimately hinges upon our previous discussion on axioms, since the key to the whole windup becomes connected to our view of what's possible within mathematics. Because you could put it this way, it's self-evidently true that whether we are awake in the real world or we're asleep in the matrix, 2 + 3 will always equal 5, right?
Yeah.
That was the example that Descartes gave. So he said, whether I'm dreaming or awake, 2 + 2 = 5. He said, it doesn't seem possible that something like that could be false. From what we know of math, it's flatly impossible for mathematical truths to somehow wind up being false. So therefore, we can safely conclude that the rules of math are axiomatic, even if it turns out that we're just sleeping in the matrix. And that really does prepare us to answer the skeptic's challenge. It leaves the proponent of atheism with no founding case, because if math is truly trustworthy, as in fact Descartes insisted that it was, then time in the matrix must be finite and not beginningless, right? So William Lane Craig, whom you've had on your program, has actually claimed that if the past were beginningless, then the present could not have occurred. I think that that's a pretty reasonable thing. Craig is one of the most gifted philosophers of time that's contemporary to us right now. So you go to him for these kinds of arguments. And so we would therefore have to say, I think it's true. I think that the past can't be infinite, that it has to have a beginning, because if there were no beginning, then the present could not have occurred. And that's absurd. So you therefore have to conclude that the matrix world itself must necessarily have a beginning. So that essentially means that if that's true in the matrix world, it's certainly true in this one, because that argument applies to life outside the vat. So therefore, it's the case that all worlds have a beginning. Now, once you establish that, you've just thrown the door open for the rest of the argument. Namely, that this first beginning of the world has a beginner, and that that beginner has a conscious will and is an autonomous being. So to explain that, you could use another illustration. Let's go ahead and use the one I used in the debate, the ever-pending birthday. You walk into a room, you've got an infinite row of tumbling dominoes, and it's an infinitely long row, and they're all collapsing. Each one takes a second to collapse. So click, 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 each domino collapses. Then you happen to notice that there's a red domino at your foot. There's all kinds of different versions of this argument. This is Thomas Aquinas argued this way. There were others that argued this way. But you essentially you notice that there's a final single red domino that's right near your foot. And so you ask yourself the question, how long does it take for the red one to go down? Well, the answer is obvious. It never goes down, because you have an infinite number of seconds, right, that are all ticking by. So that means that you have to have one domino that started this stream of dominoes going down. Click, 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 click. Something has started this. And it seems that whatever started it had a free will, because if the reason why the initial cause that set the rest of the causes in motion, if the reason for why that happened lies outside of that cause, then it and not the cause is the first cause of the universe. You see? All that happens is you iterate backwards. So what you have to be willing to admit is that there exists one cause that doesn't rely on something outside of itself to set the other causes in motion.
Yep.
And if that's true, that implies a conscious will. That's checkmate. That's checkmate right there. Is that you've just identified a first cause of the universe that has a conscious will and exists in every conceivable world. Therefore, this person, this first cause, this will is axiomatic. It can't be conceptually erased. And to me, that's the best kind of proof, because it's not dependent upon the rule of independence, right? You could always ask, well, how do we know that the person that's talking to me that says they're God, how do we know that's God? Or how do we know that Jesus is God? Maybe somebody else behind him is the God that made him. And maybe that God has a creator who created that God that created Jesus. And you just go on backwards forever. And if we've always got to do this, there's no arbitrary reason to stop. That means that the universe was never created. That's essentially where the argument leads you. So you've got to have this first cause. It's got to exist in every world that we conceive of. And, I don't see any reason to say that argument can be imploded by any means that I've ever encountered. And I've debated with lots of atheists in my evangelism. So,
yeah. So there were two questions I had. One is the one that Matt Dillahunty did bring up, and I only wanted to bring it up because it's Zeno's paradox. I remember way back, I'm trying to think, maybe 8-9 years ago when I first got into apologetics, and I didn't know really anything. I knew the cosmological argument, and my friend who was an atheist hit me with Zeno's paradox, and at the time I had no idea how to respond. But since then, I hadn't really heard it brought up that much until Matt Dillahunty brought it up. So I thought it might just be worth letting people know how to answer that. So Matt Dillahunty might say, well, yeah, it doesn't seem like we can traverse an infinite, but of course, Zeno's paradox shows that we can. So if you just think of the two ends of my room, I can walk from point A to point B, but of course that can be divided up, subdivided into an infinite amount of spaces,
right,
so to speak. And so if we can traverse an infinite there, then of course we could traverse an infinite amount of time.
Yeah. So yes, Matt brought that up in our discussion. And what I attempted to point out to Matt is that that's not an argument for the notion that we can traverse an infinite, because as Aristotle replied to Zeno, he essentially said, well, the line itself was conceptually prior to and chronologically prior to our subdivisions of it, and it was a finite space. The point is whether or not time can consume an infinite number of events so as to arrive at the present moment. And that's obviously not possible. No one thinks that's possible. I've had atheists try to say, well, what if you just simply start from one of them that's within the infinite set and you go forward to the red domino? There you've accomplished it. But the problem there, of course, is that you can't divide into infinities, because the rules of transfinite mathematics strictly disallow inverse operations in the case of transfinite arithmetic, which would include long division. So you can't divide an infinite quantity and still get sort of use that as a way to get at the red domino, so to speak. That doesn't work either. So unless the set of dominoes is finite, there is no universe. There is, you could say it this way: a universe that isn't triggered itself triggers nothing. And this is just a major, major problem. So Aristotle concluded that there was a first cause. I mean, many other thinkers after him concluded that was the case. We know Aquinas certainly concluded that. Lots of mathematicians today conclude that. Hilbert thought that was true. I just think that's, who's this guy who wrote the book, The Large Scale Structure of Space-Time? Hang on.
I'm not sure.
Yeah, this is Hawking and Ellis. Yeah, Ellis thinks that's true. Yeah, I just, scientists, philosophers, most people think that that's true. There has to be a beginning.
Yeah.
And if a beginning, then a beginner. And the question I have is, why is that invalid? Well, because it has to be according to the rule of independence. But that leads to the conclusion that nothing can be proven. That leads to philosophical nihilism. Why would we accept that if there are other arguments that show how to ground our knowledge of true propositions? Now, he raised up something else. He said, well, what about foundherentism? Isn't that a fourth option of Sextus's trilemma? But most people just think, because again, there are three options. Did we want to go over the second one? I don't know if you wanted to do that.
No, it's okay. No, as you were saying, I was looking for a question someone did put in the Q&A session. Could Ben talk about foundherentism and why it's problematic, since Matt brought it up in the debate?
Right. So Matt brought up foundherentism, and foundherentism is alleged to be, I think it's Susan Hack or something.
Susan Hawk. Susan Hawk is the way he pronounced it.
Okay. So essentially, foundherentism is a combination of coherentism, the thought experiment of coherentism, and the thought experiment of foundationalism, in order to come upon a proper basis for knowledge or evidence, whatever. And knowledge, I think knowledge is what we're getting at, because, we want to know how we know things. And it's really interesting. I mean, don't you think? I think this is interesting. Anyway, so coherentism is essentially the argument that maybe when we should just kind of go back to what we noted a moment ago, X is true because Y is the proof. Y is true because Z is the proof. The second possibility that Sextus explores is the argument of coherentism. Here, Sextus suggests that perhaps we should have responded differently to the challenge once we reached contingent proposition Z. So rather than making Z contingent upon A prime like the infinitist does, maybe we should have argued that Z was contingent upon some previous member of the original set of proofs. So in that case, we should have responded by saying something like this: contingent proposition Z is proven by contingent proposition Y. So if Y proves Z, what proves Z? Well, Y proves Z. And that really does seem to be an unacceptable solution, as I'm sure it would to most of us. And the reason is because it has all the appearances of radically adjusting the overall goal of the original inquiry. Because the inquirer is now being offered something called a circular answer. In other words, we are simply circling back to the previous proposition in the set. And of course, that immediately raises the additional question, well, then how is that different from claiming that Z is proven by A, which was the initial question, right? Well, to this, Sextus replies that what we're discussing here is whether coherency rather than independence is to be favored when settling a matter as probative. In other words, we're inquiring whether the fact that the list of proofs, at least it coheres well with itself, maybe that forms a better conclusion to our inquiry than the idea that nothing can be proven. But that was really unsatisfactory as well, because how does that show that we've identified a proper ground for knowledge? So coherentism doesn't seem to work well. And incidentally, what's very, very interesting about coherentism is that this often seems to be the favored approach of persons that argue for scientism, right? So let's just imagine that this set of proofs, right, call it A to Z, and these are all persons that can interact with each other. We ask proposition Z, why are you true? So proposition G just simply takes the warrant for the proof and tosses it like a basketball back to some previous member of the set, right? So what we're asking of science is, what's foundationally real? Well, that is, and it's just simply the basketball gets tossed around between this group of proofs. And so this essentially leads us to understand that kind of sets up what foundherentism is. Foundherentism is the idea that essentially maybe this coherency is our foundation for knowledge. But But then the question becomes, why is that different from foundationalism? And if you're willing to accept that, then what is wrong with saying Proposition Z is proven by Proposition Z? What's wrong with saying Z is self-evident?
Right.
So in that case, why fault me, the Christian? So that really doesn't seem, it just seems to me that that's just one kind of foundationalism you could identify as foundherentism, right? And I don't think that actually works as a fourth option, because I think this fourth one collapses into three, and you're still left with the three. And most people believe that that's true. Most scholars would say that's the case. So foundherentism doesn't seem to work because it's trying to sort of, have it, eat the cake and have it too, or whatever.
Yeah.
I'm forgetting the colloquialism here, but essentially, I think that really does cause us to say, well, I think that you've just forfeited the ground for arguing with the Christian that foundationalism is invalid as a form of conferring evidence upon any contingent proposition. I think that that's just prima facie evidence that the skeptic is willing to accept the very thing that the Christian has accepted, namely that certain things can be self-evident.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, absolutely. So I do have one more clip I want to play, but before that, I did want to bring this up because somebody gave us a super chat, me and John Dunphy. So thank you so much, Richard Torres. I guess that's how to pronounce your last name. How can atheists justify knowing anything if most hold to an evolutionary narrative of origins, and evolution undermines freely thinking? So this is something Tim Stratton has talked on this program before about if all our thoughts are determined, how are we justifying believing anything?
Right. I think it's a valid point, because the fundamental claim here is that we're just particles and molecules in motion, fizzing chemicals. And if that's the case, then we have no inward soul. There is no me that's deciding to do anything. And that means that all the decisions I'm making are simply the result of external stimuli. And free will is an illusion, albeit, as philosophers have pointed out, a very persistent illusion. So if that's the case, then it seems that free will is eviscerated. Strict determinism is the only thing that matters. And that, of course, leads me to believe that we really, therefore, have no reason to justify trusting in the intuitions of our minds. How do we know that anything that we think in our minds would count as sound reasoning? It's a very murky concept. So that's a very good point.
Yeah. So here's Matt's objection. If an axiom, basically, if it's an axiom, you can't have evidence for it. And I think I have a better objection, but we're going to go to Matt's first. Oh, hold on, I forgot to bring it. There we go.
Matt who? Is this Matt Dillahunty?
Yes.
Is the person questioning Matt Dillahunty?
Basically, this is his objection. So this is after you've given the axiomatic argument, and this is him objecting to its use as evidence.
Oh, got it.
Okay. The fact that we assume something as a necessity is because we do not have good evidence for it. If we have good evidence for it, we don't need to assume it. We just demonstrate it. So if your entire case is that God is axiomatic, then you're acknowledging there is no good evidence for God, or at least there's no good evidence going to be presented for God, because if there's good evidence, we don't need to assume.
There you go. So so he seems to be saying, like, well, we can't have evidence that mathematics works, because in order to even do mathematical operations like 2 + 2 = 4, you have to just assume it's true. So if you're just assuming God, how can you possibly have evidence for it?
Yeah. And that would seem to deny that logical demonstration is sufficient for evidence. And the problem with that is, once again, you just simply ask the atheist, well, what's the reason for that? Why should we believe that logical demonstration cannot count as evidence? I seem to remember that Matt said something in the debate to the effect of, well, in order for us to know that 2 + 2 really does equal 4, we need operational instances of this in the empirical world. And I deny that point.
Mhm.
I don't think we need a single operational instance of 2 + 2 = 4 in the visible world to conclude that 2 + 2 = 4.
Right.
It is not dependent on operational instances in the real world for us to know that these things are true. So I think that this really does create some major problems. And I think the chief problem that arises due to that sort of an assertion is, once again, the implosion of the closure principle. Because if you're saying that, essentially what you're saying is that we have to be able to be sensitive to the possibility of something's being wrong, even though we have evidence for it being right, in order for us to say that we really do have knowledge of the thing. And that's just the sensitivity requirement. And if he's essentially saying we can't have that in the case of math, so then how do we know then, therefore, that any of these axioms of math are true? And that really does seem to lead to the implosion of the closure principle, because it's relying on sensitivity, the sensitivity requirement and the adherence requirement to settle whether or not something counts as knowledge. So if at the end of the day we don't know that 2 + 2 = 4, then I think we just have to say that you might as well just bring all of reasoning and logic to a grinding halt. And why would you do that? Again, if you're really engaging seriously in philosophy, for the love of it, and I can't think of a single reason why. I mean, obviously people engage in this kind of discussion because they're curious. To be a philosopher is almost irresistible. So,
Yeah.
I don't know if I'm answering it as best as it could be
No,
answered.
I think so. And I think one of the places later on in the debate when Matt kind of stepped on his own foot was when he kind of went to Wikipedia and looked up the definition of axiom. And you did talk about this earlier, the difference between axiom and a presupposition. And essentially the definition of an axiom he read was what should have been the definition of a presupposition, which is something that we just assume is true in order to kind of do other things. But then if that's his definition, then that refutes his own point that you can't have confirming evidence for it. Because, so for example, you could assume uniformitarianism as an axiom under his definition, but then you could have confirming evidence to say that that was a correct presupposition to have. And so I thought that was just kind of one of the ways he stepped on his own foot there.
Good. I mean, yeah. I think that sort of thing is a good point. I find it difficult to resist going there. And even if I was not a Christian, I would still have a difficult time going there because I have a naturally curious and counterfactual mind, and so I can't help asking questions. And so it seems to me that my faith in God, and my belief in the gospel, my experience of God, which I believe to be wholly supernatural, answered prayers, etc., miracles, things that I have seen happen in my life, divine healings, all that kind of stuff. Just taking all that stuff and putting it on one side of the world and me on the other, I still could not keep myself from asking the question because I'm naturally curious, and most people are. Apparently 6-year-old girls are curious enough to ask philosophers in train stations in the UK, how do I know I exist? So what chance does what chance the rest of us have? First, we're going to ask questions.
Yeah. Real quick, I'm going to try to adjust a wire on my end because your audio is coming in. It started getting kind of echoey. I'm going to try to see if it's on my end. I don't know if there's a wire that maybe can loose on your end. Yeah, it still seems to be echoing from your end. I don't know what caused that, but no. So here I kind of thought of this on the spot as you're going through, and I thought, okay, let me put on my atheist hat for a minute and see if how would I, if I were an atheist, object to the axiomatic argument. And I think the way I would go about it would say, okay, first I'll grant you two of the premises. Number one, quote unquote finite series of events into the past, and then number two, I might grant, say, a version of foundationalism. And so what I might want to say is, well, let's suppose we live in a B theory of time. And if we live in a B theory of time, as Dr. Craig has pointed out, that wouldn't necessarily mean that there's a beginning to the universe in a temporal sense. Rather, there's just a first, or what would you say? An end point, a first point of the block. Yeah, the first point of that block. But that first point of that block could have existed eternally, so to speak. And then going back to, say, foundationalism, I might take the Graham-Oppie route and just say it's a brute fact that this B theory of the universe exists the way it does. And so that's foundational, but it's foundational way where it doesn't need a rational explanation, because that kind of is the definition of a brute fact, is there just is no explanation of why that thing exists. So suppose I put on my atheist hat and I say that I think we live in a B theory of time, so there really isn't a beginning in a temporal sense, and it's just a brute fact that we exist like this.
Right. But I think what Dr. Craig has beautifully shown, again, he's probably one of our best philosophers of time, secular or Christian.
Absolutely.
And he essentially points out that this outermost extremity of your, bijective map of time or whatever, I think is what it is. It's mapping onto itself. There still is a first moment. Even if it doesn't come into existence, that doesn't mean that there's no beginning. And I think that it's a fairly strong point. Even on a B theory of time, you couldn't escape that there is a beginning of time. And because there is a first moment.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And I want to do an episode on kind of independent philosophical arguments against the B theory of time, because I do think there are some really bad philosophical problems with it. But since we've referenced a couple of times, I just wanted to show people this book by William Lane Craig, Time and Eternity. Such a great book. Might be one of my second or third favorite from him. So I know you had mentioned to me that you had heard some kind of odd objections to the axiomatic argument. I didn't know if you wanted to bring some of those up.
Well, I think I'd mentioned prior to the show that I knew about some odd objections to the implosion of skepticism.
Oh, okay. Sorry, I got it mixed up.
Yeah. So I have encountered some odd objections to this, and these might be helpful as a way to sort of conclude the show. Maybe another 5-10 minutes on some of these, because I think that they are these are slippery things that tend to come up. So you could just simply put these forthcoming comments into a basket labeled maintaining the argument, and just simply leave that bucket in the back of your mind. And then as these objections pop up, as you're sort of conversating with the atheists, you can say, oh, that's right. There was an explanation for that. And you can just put the explanation out. So I call these sort of roadblocks to religious knowledge. And the roadblock number one that I point out in my book is essentially the claim, well, Ben Fischer, your argument is not 100% certain. So in other words, the first roadblock that you can expect to encounter when you're attempting to show that religious skepticism has been imploded just becomes a clever variation on the same basic skeptical argument that we've just spent the last several minutes dismantling. Because, for example, a skeptic might grant you, after hearing the argument, that it presently appears to be true that Nozick's sensitivity requirement creates all sorts of odd exceptions to the rule of P not Q. And some might even capitulate to the point that P can be an acceptable ground for concluding not Q, provided P is some sort of an axiomatic proposition. Sometimes you have a skeptic that's willing to grant you that. But, he says, what if future discoveries in epistemology upend Nozick's novel exception to the rule of P not Q, showing that the sensitivity requirement no longer implodes the closure principle? I mean, what's to prevent that from happening, right? After all, everyone thought that Plato's definition of knowledge was correct for over 2,000 years, and yet it was later challenged. So for reasons like this, it's never safe to conclude, alleges the skeptic, that any discovery in philosophy is final, which also means that no one, including Ben Fischer, can be 100% certain that this argument is correct. But that objection really does commit the same crime against reason that we've been pointing out all along. And this becomes obvious as you view the premises to the argument. Just consider, number one, if I know that this argument is 100% certain, I know that no future discovery in philosophy will ever upend it. But number two, I cannot know whether future discoveries in philosophy will upend Ben's argument. Therefore, three, I cannot know that Ben's argument is 100% certain. Now, at the risk of sounding pedantic, the second premise of that argument plainly assumes Nozick's sensitivity requirement once again as a necessary condition for knowledge. Think about it. Can we sensibly, that is by the use of our senses, know that no future discoveries will arise against my argument in the future? Of course not. And why not? Because we can't empirically access the future. Our beliefs that this will not happen is insensitive. But by making sensitivity a requirement for knowing that my argument is correct, the first premise of the argument, if P not Q, becomes invalidated. Therefore, the very structure of the argument becomes undermined and the deductive conclusion becomes upended. So that objection comes up, just, defending yourself against it becomes pretty easy once you understand how to wield what I've been describing here. But I think, though, before moving on, I probably should put out one caution. And that is simply this, that my argument does not justify the claim that the Christian knows the future. Of course, it's quite possible that some future philosophical development could unseat this argument entirely. But my point is that the skeptic cannot claim this as a reasonable cause for denying my argument. Instead, what he has to do is show that there's some sort of primitive logical fault within the argument itself in order to show why my conclusion is invalid. And what's probably helpful to keep in mind is how important it becomes to distinguish between philosophical doubt and psychological doubt. I would argue, as have others, that philosophical doubts arise due to obvious violations of known rules and principles of epistemology. But psychological doubt is different. Psychological doubt would be based on non-evidenced reasons or grounds, such that when you ask the skeptic, why do you doubt? He would say, because I doubt. There is no other reason but my doubt. So therefore, I would argue that we are justified in ignoring psychological doubt, so long as doing that would not violate any known rule or convention of epistemology. Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So that's kind of one of the main tenets. I maybe probably just hit one more of these. I won't hit too many more of these right now for the time being, because they would probably take too long. But here's another roadblock. What if Nozick's sensitivity requirement is right, and there's actually some way to form evidence chains that doesn't include the closure principle? That is an argument that sometimes gets put forward. Some skeptics attempt to argue that what we haven't done on your program is ruled out the possibility that Nozick's sensitivity requirement is indeed a valid criterion for knowledge. After all, who cares if the rule of P not Q fails to lead me to knowledge? At least we can still argue that God's invisibility is a valid reason to deny his existence. And then and just, punk it all. Let's go ahead and drink and eat, for tomorrow we die. Now, obviously, that is an objection that will sometimes come up. It's a bit more sophisticated maybe than could be answered shortly in a program like this. But in order to avoid the appearance of my somehow dodging a perceived valid objection, I would advise the ambitious reader to go to my website and pull up my article. It's fairly scholarly, so you have to be prepared that you're going to be reading some dense stuff. But pull up my article showing some of the problems associated with Nozick's overall theory of knowledge, because the implosion of the closure principle is not the only problem. And even Nozick admitted that. So if you want to read what are the problems with Nozick's overall theory of knowledge, I mention a few of them in my article on my website entitled God and the Challenge of Skepticism. Now, I think that might be hidden behind a paywall, but gosh, I'd have to check on this now. You know what you could probably do is go to howtodefeatskepticism.com and just simply download my starter kit. It includes my book. It includes a professionally produced audio version of the book. And then it even includes, you can get $50 worth of classes from me for $5. Kind of it's just some silly, stupid deal. So go to that website and you'll find kind of the entry point, and you'll be able to get access to this stuff. It's like $5 for a cup of coffee. Boom.
Absolutely.
You got it. Absolutely. Yeah. So if people want to do that, and then there are, in addition to these several roadblocks, there are other ones that are described in the book. There are other ones that are described in my class. Literally $5 is like going to college for $5. It's just ridiculous. I think it includes this workbook. So this is like a 78-page course workbook that goes along with the master course. There's over 100 footnotes from scholarly journals, monograms, and books in this volume. And you get that in addition to your audiobook, in addition to How to Defeat Skepticism, which is my other book, in addition to, like hours of, arguments on this stuff. So, I would just encourage anyone to go to that and, work your way through the material. And if you have questions, go ahead and fill out one of my contact forms on my website. I'll get back to you for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll actually add a link to that in the description of this video just to make it easier for people to find and get to. So if you guys are watching this after the pre-recorded version, check the description. There'll be a link to that.
Awesome.
So yeah, I can't remember if we kind of got off on a trail there, if you had finished. Yeah, no, I guess that was the answer to the last point. Were there any more points you wanted to bring up along those lines?
Yeah, I think that, I don't want to overwhelm anyone.
Right.
We could keep going deeper. And there we're inquiring into, that's a lot of epistemology already that we've discussed. But I think that what I would say in conclusion is that it appears, at least to me, that we do have a reasonable ground for concluding that it's possible to have religious knowledge, and that's true whether or not you're saying, if I know that P is true and P strictly implies Q, then I know that Q is true. That applies if you're simply saying, if I know that P, if I have a reasonable justification for concluding that P is likely to be true at numerical value X, and I also happen to know that P implies Q, then in that case, I also know that I have a reasonable justification for concluding that Q is true to level X, numerical value X or higher. So it even would apply in cases like that, where it's not absolute certainty. It's just, a standard closure principle, but with this slight modification there, you're kind of working with probabilities. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. Does.
Yeah. So I think it's a good, strong basis for saying, yes, I know that I have religious knowledge. And I think that I would be surprised to find an atheist saying that we have a way to show that this is false because the axiomatic argument is crap or something like that. To me, that's just silly. It's likelier that the universe is a hologram, and that's true. And I really think that the argument that the universe is a hologram, for example, would just be ridiculous. And so does this guy, George Ellis. This is the guy that knows more about cosmology than any man alive, and he thinks that argument is stupid too. So just in case we get an atheist coming after you.
Absolutely. So I do have one more question here, if you don't mind.
Sure.
It's from Plantains Bulldog, but before I put it on the screen, he did ask me to bring something up to you, and he typed a couple of paragraphs, and I'll try to condense it as much as I can. Hopefully I don't butcher it. But he said his takeaway, why he thought Matt's argument was illegitimate, that this wasn't evidence, was twofold, which is, number one, the axiomatic argument is an argument, it's a line of reasoning that counts in favor of a proposition. And so that, by definition, is evidence. But then he said, also twofold, if an atheist, love to talk about predictive power, if you can start with the axiom and make predictions based off it, that are things we see in the real world, that would count as evidence. And so examples I think of, Josh Rasmussen's been on the program, he's talked about, given the hypothesis of theism, you might predict that there would be moral creatures that exist, creatures that had free will, the ability to bring things into existence as kind of co-authors of reality. And he even predicts that, given certain models of theism, that you would expect certain types of suffering, and because that's supposed to count as an argument against theism. But I guess I just get your thoughts on that I just don't see any reason to think that this can't be evidence.
Right. Because if it is conferring evidence upon some sort of conclusion, if that proposition is doing that, there's evidence that is happening here. And moreover, I would say that the appeal to both logic, reason, and mathematics itself becomes a justification for admitting that the axiom is sound.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then so perhaps that's the
Yeah,
last
yeah.
piece of questioning on this topic. He says, if I understand the argument correctly, then you're saying it is axiomatically true that God exists. What if someone tries to put this into a reductio so that anything can be that axiom? And I think Matt did try this in kind of his way. On one instance said, what if I just said it's an axiom that no God exists? Or what if I just said it's an axiom that Allah exists? So
right. And that sort of seems to fall on the sword of the notion that we can't have an infinite regress of past events. So if the atheist was able to show that an infinite regress of past temporal events was indeed possible, that would be catastrophic to my faith. But I don't think that something like that is possible.
I don't either.
Because it's axiomatically certain that we must have a finite and not an infinite set of past events.
Mm-hmm.
And there's no way on any account of math, logic, I've just never heard an argument that's ever sounded compelling, that ever caused me to have reason. This really did. Essentially, this study started in 2011 for me, as I was experiencing, after being in the ministry for 10, heading towards 15 years, there's the most profound religious doubt I'd ever encountered in my life. It was a soul crushing event. And I think it would have taken me down if it had not been for the faithfulness of God, the presence of the Holy Spirit. And then in addition to that, this information, this closed the deal. I just couldn't resist doubting that atheism was false or true after this. I could not resist the notion that atheism is false. I found that to be irresistible.
Yeah, and I would echo that sentiment. And I think one thing I can't remember if it was Josh Rasmussen or Cameron Bertuzzi who brought this argument up. I think it might have been Cameron Bertuzzi, because when you say let's suppose philosophically they could prove there is an infinite series of events into the past, they pointed out that would still in and of itself need an explanation. If you think, for example, you can imagine an infinite series of, say, dogs giving birth to other dogs, right? And that just goes on infinitely.
Mm-hmm.
Well, you can ask the question, well, why an infinite series of dogs and not chickens? Why an infinite series? And then so even if there's an infinite series of events into the past, why is the universe the way it is? Why is reality the way it is? It still seems you can make a contingency argument based on that.
Yeah, it's a very good point. I think C.S. Lewis once said it this way, that a bird that had existed from eternity would be no less strange than an egg that had been produced by no chicken. I mean, either way, whether you're choosing the egg or the bird to have existed from eternity, neither of those options is any less weird, and both require an explanation. So, yeah, I agree with that. And this is why I think that Christians can know that there is a strong grounding for some of the most fundamental propositions of the faith. Now, from there, you just get into deductive arguments. So you get into, or not deductive, but inductive arguments from history, et cetera.
Yeah.
And I think that, and it's just funny. Atheists will sometimes say that inductive arguments cannot count in the battle for knowledge. It can only be deductive certainty that we allow, because our propositions about religious knowledge have to be founded on deductive certainty. And I go into this in the book. You can get it for free at howtodefeatskepticism.com. You can see the refutation for that too. But basically all of these different odd, little floaters that people try to insert into the conversation wind up not working for a multiplicity of reasons. And so for any Christian that's willing to think, it does require thinking. if you are listening to this program, if you're watching Stellman on a regular basis and you're trying to find answers to these questions and you're struggling and just, like white knuckling it the whole way through, you have to understand that one of the ways that God is going to deliver you from your doubt is by having you learn. You can't get around that point. You will have to stretch yourself mentally to get at the information you need to get the doubt to stop. But that said, once you have the information, it just naturally stops. I can't explain it. Just kind of goes away.
Yeah, no, I absolutely can echo that. Certain times in my life, and I've talked about things on the program before, just my view of reality changes. Once you have a certain view of reality, then you can make sense of certain emotional things that otherwise may have been very detrimental to your faith. But once you have a certain view of reality and intellectually that's true, then that can just help you recognize the irrationality of some of your emotional doubts, and it just puts everything in a new perspective. So
absolutely. And what I would also want to say to people struggling with that sort of thing, if you have listeners out there that are like that, maybe we could have gotten to some of these points earlier in the program, but you have to understand the emotional crisis that in your mind seemed to lead to the doubt. What you need to understand is that the emotional crisis was not the cause of your doubt. The formal argument of skepticism living in your heart before the pain came was the cause of your doubt. And getting an answer to it is critical. I remember one time sitting at the dinner table with my family, and he was 5 or 6 years old at the time. My 5-year-old son looked up at me and said, "Dad, if God made the world, then what made God?" I looked over at my wife. She looked at me with a face that only a husband could understand. She just was like, how in the world did he think to ask that question? And I just looked at him. I said, "Son, what you need to understand is that you are too young to comprehend the answer to your question. But what I want you to rest assured in is that your dad has done debates with atheists, and to date, no one has ever been able to overcome my answer to that question. So what I want you to do right now, son, is just trust me that I know the answer to the question, and when you're old enough, I'll tell you." He responded in a way that I'll never forget. He leaped up from his chair at the dinner table and just hugged me as hard as he could. And would that it were true that kind of an answer would hold our children forever. And what I would want to say is that it won't. And all that it takes to expose that argument within the hearts of human beings is a crisis. But the pain did not cause the doubt. The argument was there. The argument of skepticism existed in your head, probably from the time that you were a small child. And all that the pain did was just simply agitate that so that argument mattered to you. So the way to overcome this is not to simply go to counseling and get rid of your pain. You need an answer to the argument. You got to get to the bottom of this by actually growing with your mind, loving God with your mind. And as you do, you will find that the argument doesn't stand. So can I just pray for your viewers? I just feel that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That'd be a great way to end the show.
Yeah, let's do it. Lord, I just thank you for the people that are watching this program, Lord, whether they be outsiders to the faith who really are wondering about you and whether or not you are real. I pray that you would reveal yourself to them. And for those believers that are watching this, looking for answers, they're listening to Stellman for answers. Father God, I pray that you would send them on the journey of loving you with all their minds. And that as they do this, Lord, they can rest assured that the answers will come. I pray this in the name of Jesus. Do your work, Holy Spirit. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen. Yeah, and just so last time, people, please go check out benfisherministries.com. Links to stuff he's mentioned in the description. Subscribe to his YouTube channel, Ben Fisher Ministries. And until next time, this has been a very great episode, and perhaps we can do something more in the future along the lines of the topic you just mentioned there at the end. So yeah,
Mhm.
that would be great. So yeah, everybody, thanks for being here. Ben, thank you so much, brother, for taking the time, and really do
Absolutely.
appreciate it.
Yeah. Thank you for doing this. What you do is this is awesome. So
Absolutely. So God
yeah.
bless everyone, and I'll see you next.